Paul. I'd like to invite Anthony Hobley, please, who's the Chief Executive of the Carbon Tracker from the UK.
Well, thank you very much, and it's wonderful to be here. And I feel like a little bit of a fraud because I'm not a scientist, and I'm certainly not an Arctic scientist. I do have a chemistry and physics degree, but I gave up the white lab coat about 25 years ago for the pinstripe. So my training is as a commercial corporate lawyer. And I run an organisation that's made up of former financial market professionals, the biggest part of which is a team of 7 investment bank analysts, or former investment bank analysts. So what, you may ask, am I doing speaking at this side event? Well, actually, the previous presentations was a good segue because there's obviously a lot of interest about exploiting the resources in the Arctic, and there's been a lot in the press about oil, and particularly Shell, but also Statoil and many other companies. So I want to talk a little bit about the economics of exploiting those, particularly oil and gas resources in the Arctic. Just need to set the scene a little bit. One of the things, if you haven't heard of Carbon Tracker, one of the things that we are most well known for is taking a key aspect of the climate science, the carbon budget, particularly the 900 gigatons we have left, and translating that, putting that in a frame that the financial markets understand. Our audience is the financial markets. So we looked at that by comparison to the amount of carbon locked up in the world's oil, gas and coal reserves, and identified the disconnect, and we termed that the carbon bubble back in 2011, or unburnable carbon, and that's, bubbles is certainly in 2011 something financial markets are very familiar with, and we've created various other financial terms like fossil fuel risk premium, unburnable carbon, and so forth. But the simple theory is we've got about 900 gigatons that we can still put into the atmosphere and have, if I've got this right, well, I think that's the 50% probability of staying below 2 degrees. And, that means on a 50% probability, we can maybe burn up to 1/3 of the carbon locked up in the world's oil, gas and coal reserves. If we want an 80% of probability of staying below 2 degrees, it means, on very simple terms, we can maybe burn 20% of the carbon locked up in the oil, gas and coal reserves. And that has quite interesting financial implications. And we've moved on now to look at all of the world's oil, gas and coal projects, and look at them through both a financial risk and a climate risk lens, and to try and identify those oil, gas and coal projects that we need, because they're low cost and potentially lower carbon, within the 900 gigatons over the next 30 years as we transition to a climate-secure global energy system. And all of those oil, gas and coal projects either operating now or planned to be developed, and that would include many Arctic projects over the next 30 years, that we do not need. So if you think about it in this sort of thermometer case, it's those projects in the sort of orange, amber and red section. And that's where we need to focus a lot of our efforts, because it's those projects that are both high climate risk and high financial risk that we need to take off the table to keep us on that 2 degrees trajectory. And just a key part of the background, what we are finding is this idea of climate risk. Our ultimate mission is to align financial market and capital market risk with climate risk. Through our financial analysis, we believe that we've identified that the financial markets have yet to catch up. They're a little bit like that cartoon character, if any of you grew up with it, the Roadrunner, who quite often runs off the edge of the cliff and he keeps running before he realizes the world around him has changed. And the world that is changing is increasingly cheaper, clean technology, in energy efficiency, the fact that the capital costs of finding, exploring, developing and extracting fossil fuels are rising dramatically, and the Arctic again is a good example of that, as are tar sands and ultra deep sea, and of course the costs of clean energy are falling dramatically, and last but not least, climate policy, the sort of thing we're discussing here in Paris. That is the changing world that's creating more and more risk for the business model of these fossil fuel companies like Shell and Statoil, that have been pouring billions into exploring and trying to develop oil in the Arctic. And we firmly believe, through our financial analysis, if we can get the markets to see that risk and factor that risk in, fossil fuel exploration and development will pay the true cost of capital that it should be paying, and that will level the playing field with, yet further, with clean finance, clean energy, and so forth. So that's what we're ultimately about. And what we did when we came to oil back in May 2014 is we bought the databases, the commercial databases that have information on all of the world's oil projects, and we took the workhorse of the financial markets that every single analyst will use, a cost curve, and we combined it with carbon intensities to produce a carbon supply cost curve for oil. Now, when we did that piece of work, we were very much of the view that we were looking at that sort of slightly longer term risk, the disconnect between all of the world's oil projects and the 2 degrees budget. And what we found, actually, our report was a sort of tale of two cities in many respects. Yes, there was that major disconnect. But what we also found, and this was back in May 2014 when the oil price was around $115, $120 a barrel, you remember those days, we found there were a lot of projects going on above this $80 to $90 barrel mark. Some would require an oil price of $200 a barrel to ever break even, let alone make any money. And we could not understand why the oil and gas companies were pouring billions into these projects, many of those projects at the top end of the cost curve in the Arctic, that, forget climate change for a little bit, did not make financial sense in any way or form under the current policy and financial framework. If you then apply a 2 degrees framework, you move right the way down to the $60 a barrel mark. And it's only those projects under the $60 break-even, i.e. would need a $60 oil price to break even, that we would use within a 2 degrees budget that made both climate and financial sense. So there's two key important markers here. Now with oil, well, falling again at around the $40 mark, I mean, this looks very prescient. I remember there was a senior oil and gas analyst from one of the world's big investment banks came up to us and said, well, why are you worrying about this $80 mark? What are you guys smoking? You know, the days of sub-$100 oil are over forever. This was a very highly paid, very intelligent, very smart oil and gas analyst earning many, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of pounds from one of the world's big investment banks. So many in the financial markets did not see what happened coming. The crash in oil prices. And that's a key part of the story because, and I'll give you a little clue. Do you want to guess who has most of that sub-$60 oil, the stuff you could use over the next 30 years within the 2 degrees budget? Do you want to guess where 80% of that sits? Saudi Arabia. And in many ways, if we are moving to a world where we're going to need less and less oil because of new technology, efficiency, and a 2 degrees framework, of course, if you're in the oil business, you want to be the last man standing. You want to sell the last marginal barrel of oil. You want to keep your market share. And if you happen to have the low marginal cost oil anyway, you don't want all these high cost competitors. So what do? You crash the price to ensure that none of that is commercially viable. So you ensure you are maintaining market share in a world moving towards a low carbon 2 degrees scenario. So actually, 2 degrees approach is pretty damn good for the Saudis. And that's all very well, but in terms of how shareholders and others in the financial markets interact, we needed to go on and look at this in the context of oil, gas and coal. So we followed on with our coal report and our gas report, but we've just published in the last couple of weeks our danger zone report. We've brought the three together to look at it in the holistic whole. And that tells us a number of things. It tells us that if we view this through the climate lens, coal is by far and away the biggest part of the problem. Through a financial lens, though, coal is a minnow. Coal is, there's only billions, hundreds of billions at stake if we go ahead. But it also tells you that there is no financial case whatsoever for any new coal mine or any new coal basin. It would be financially insane to put your money into that. The only way any new coal mine is going to go ahead is if it's underpinned by government subsidies. No private sector financier would put their money into that because it would just be insane. It also tells you, by and large, that existing oil and gas reserves in the oil and gas industry, we need those over the next 30 years. So as long as the oil and gas industry accepts they go ex-growth, They no longer go out there and potentially waste billions or trillions on developing yet more resources in the Arctic, in the tar sands, in the ultra deep sea. They can be part of the solution, and quite a valuable part of the solution, as long as they accept they go ex-growth. And again, I think what we're seeing with the low oil price situation is a play by the national oil companies, the so-called NOCs, to call the bluff of the private oil companies who've been trying to develop many of these resources, for example, in the Arctic. So let's drill in very quickly to what our danger zone report says about the Arctic. Well, we are facing a culture shock, and I think the oil and gas industry is facing a culture shock. And I think the financial case is very clearly for them to go ex-growth. If they do not accept that, they can destroy a huge amount of financial value by desperately trying to pretend the world hasn't changed and desperately trying to develop resources in the Arctic, in the tar sands, and the ultra deep sea. And that matters to all of us because that's our pensions. If they're allowed to do that, they could have a very dramatic negative impact on many of our own investments, the investments we rely on for our retirement. But just to finish on that, many of the industry projections are still projecting a future of growth and growth in demand of 20 to 30% for their products. When you drill in to those demand projections, as we have done in our Lost in Transition report, you find there's about 10 major assumptions underpinning those future demand scenarios for oil, gas and coal. Population growth. When you look at the assumptions for population growth that the oil and gas companies and even some of the IEA scenarios take, they take some of the highest projections of future population growth. They don't take the moderate, medium ones. When you look at their future projections for GDP growth, guess what? They take the highest projections for future GDP growth, not the medium ones. So you would start to think, well, they've got a preference for the higher end of future projections, wouldn't you? When you look at the projections they take for the growth in alternative technologies like solar and wind, you'd imagine they take the highest, don't you? No, they take the lowest future projections for the growth of solar, for the growth of wind, for the growth of energy efficiency, i.e. they are cherry-picking all of the assumptions that suit their view of the world and substantiate their business model. Because, of course, they need to raise money. They need to justify these huge expenditures in the Arctic and the tar sands and so on to their investors, to their shareholders, and to their boards. So, of course, but the critical thing is here, many governments rely on those industry projections. And actually, I think some of those industry projections are fatally flawed and need to be looked at very carefully. So let's turn to the Arctic. So, again, we've seen this for the last few days. The OPEC meeting has ended in disarray, and they're not even talking about the traditional OPEC cap on production. That seems to not even be on the agenda anymore, and oil prices are falling yet again. The Saudis, despite the pain it's causing them, they are very determined on this course of action, and they're not going to turn off the taps anytime soon. So at least for the next year or two, we are in a very, very low oil price environment, which means that Arctic projects simply do not add up financially. And even if the price returns to a long-term equilibrium around $80 or $90, which we think it will, many of those projects still do not add up financially. They do not make financial sense, and they certainly don't make climate sense. So we can identify about 69 billion of planned capital expenditure in Arctic oil projects that is clearly surplus to 2 degrees C, and we think is extremely high risk. And any investor, any shareholder should be examining those very, very carefully. And this is over 50% of the existing proposed projects in the Arctic. Simply do not add up financially. And if we look at gas, it's a very similar story. In our Lost in Transition report, we're a little bit more positive about gas. We do think there is some limited growth potential in gas, even in a 2 degrees C environment, but not anywhere near as much as the industry would have you believe. And many of the LNG projects in that sector are extremely high cost and very financially risky in our view when you run the numbers. So we think there's about 20 billion of planned capital expenditure for Arctic gas. Again, surplus to 2 degrees C does not make financial sense, which is over 68% of the existing and proposed gas projects in the Arctic. And of course, and if they don't go, and of course they don't make they don't make environmental sense. This would save about 1.6 gigatons of CO2. If these projects that do not make financial sense do not go ahead, that's equivalent to 22 coal mines. We don't even look in our analysis at all the other environmental problems these projects cause. So this doesn't factor in all of the impacts on reputation and PR that Shell have certainly run into, all the impacts from methane, black carbon, all the local pollution impacts. So, all of those costs and detriments to the business model and the company would come up on top of, the fact that these do not make financial sense, the bottom line. Now, we're doing something right because I can't resist using this line from the Financial Times on the day Mark Carney made his big announcement. Of all the recent ideas climate change campaigners have come up with, although we don't see ourselves as financial campaigners, we see ourselves as financial analysts, but anyway, have come up with to convince the world to do more to curb global warming, none has been as potent as the concept of stranded fossil fuel assets. And clearly, if our financial analysis is right, and companies go ahead with their plans in the Arctic, there will be a lot of stranded financial assets in the Arctic should many of these projects go ahead. So just to finish, the carbon bubble, unburnable carbon analysis has got a huge amount of traction in the English-speaking part of the world, and actually the Nordic countries. Not as much outside, so we've had a lot of the key pieces of work translated into Arabic, Chinese, French, German, Japanese, Spanish, Portuguese. So if you're from any of those parts of the world, you can now have access to some of the underlying analysis and research. So on that, I will finish, and thank you very much for having a non-scientist here to talk today.
Thank you very much, Anthony.